Welcome to the Future of Less Work, where we explore how work is transforming one conversation at a time. I'm Nirit Cohen, and today's episode will ask, if the future of leadership isn't about having all the answers, how do we need to learn to ask better questions? I'm joined by Margaret Andrews, a seasoned executive academic and the author of Manage Yourself to Lead Others. I invited Margaret for this conversation because she's suggesting the journey to becoming a better leader doesn't start with managing others, it starts with managing yourself. Margaret, welcome to the Future of Less Work.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be here.
Let's start with that. Why are you shifting the focus from, the tools that we teach them to people to manage other people to manage ourselves?
Yeah, so I actually think all of those tools are very helpful. They're great tools in the toolbox, but I think that we need to back up a step to understand and to manage ourselves before we lead other people. So the idea is that if we understand ourselves, we understand how we are perhaps similar and different from other people, and that those differences are our features, not necessarily our flaws, and what make us who we are. So I have a bunch of questions that I use to help people sort of get underneath that. And then because once we understand ourselves, it helps us to understand other people. And I believe that leadership is essentially a relationship. So if you don't understand the other side, it's very difficult to have a relationship. It's kind of a one-sided relationship or
Yeah,
not a
and that's
relationship.
actually a really nice description. One of the things that touched me, and I'm pretty sure that probably triggered your journey, was you actually tell a story in the beginning of the book about your own moment of revelation, or rather, maybe a good manager who put the mirror up.
Yeah, yeah. So for those that don't know it, um, uh, years ago in my career, I had a job where I was doing quite well, and my boss left, and a new boss took over, and we did not gel well. Let's just say that we just kind of talked past each other. I'm sure people can relate to that. We've all had bosses where we completely connected with, and others where we don't.
Yeah.
And this one was we didn't. And so when just one day when we were talking and I'm sitting across his desk, he says to me, you're not self-aware. And it was not said in a, hey, you may not know this, let me help you. It was said in kind of a, you're broken and can't be fixed kind of way. And so I was really, really shocked by this because, throughout my career, nobody had ever said anything even remotely like this. So it was pretty shocking. And he went on to say I was overly ambitious, didn't understand how I came across to people, and on and on. And so, I was pretty quiet in that meeting because I just didn't even have the words. I didn't even really think about how to respond. But later, actually much later, when I really kind of calmed down and picked it apart and really thought about what he said, is when it kind of dawned on me that, I actually think he's right. Because I certainly had an underperforming relationship with my boss, but, there were a few people on my team that I think were anxious, might have felt unappreciated, and when I really stopped to think about it, I was kind of alarmed by that because it was not in any way what I wanted, but it was what it was, and so
So,
I
so
wanted to
he did
change it.
not. Yeah, he did not give you the feedback in a way that you would
Yes.
expect leaders to do, but basically he did give you a gift, right? He basically told you
Absolutely.
something about your maybe communication style, maybe triggers, and you talk about these triggers, right? These emotional triggers that we all have, but if we're not aware of them, that they cause us to speak a certain way, react a certain way, and that doesn't work for those relationships, right?
That's right, that's right, and absolutely. I do tell people feedback is a gift, but sometimes gifts come in ugly packages. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean that the gift itself is bad. It just means it wasn't presented in a way that was, as easily digestible as we might like.
And so actually that's why I kind of, really like the book, because you're saying, okay, there's a way to, it's, I mean, looking in the mirror is hard. And
Mhm,
not
mhm,
everyone has that self awareness. So you're giving them a toolkit. Can we talk about
mhm.
that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I have um, I have 3 questions and 6 questions that I think form some of the basis for this. And the 6 questions are, the first one is around who and whose thinking has shaped you as an individual, right? So
Mm.
this is you can imagine, right? This is a very long list. It includes, obviously parents and siblings and childhood friends and extended family, teachers that you had, especially when you were younger, coaches, college roommates, first bosses, just the list goes on. It includes people that helped you and people that hurt you, right? Because all of them have had some level of influence on you, the way you see
So why
yourself.
does it matter that we spend time thinking about that?
Because part of understanding ourselves is understanding our backstory, understanding how did we get to this place right now. Uh, and so a big part of our backstory is the people in our lives, right? And sometimes they can be strangers. On my list of things, I have a couple of things that a total stranger told me. I don't even know this person's name, but turned out to be very helpful. But it's also movies you've watched, discussions you've had, classes you've taken, right? There's lots of things here because then you can start to see these patterns of, oh, that's why I think this way, or that's why I respond this way. So that's question one. As you can imagine, that's a huge question, and lots of people have things in their past that are painful, and sometimes don't want to go back there, and I do understand that, and so, you may wanna tread lightly on some of these things, but, there's a quote by British author C.S. Lewis that I think is so helpful here, and that is that he said, "You can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending," and to me, that is what part of this is, right? Understanding your backstory means that you can understand it so you don't have to keep playing it out.
Yeah,
Um,
and
s
and it goes back to this idea that we all have the voices in our heads that speak to us, and sometimes they're, you know, we're not aware of them, and you're trying to get us to be aware of them by kinda looking at how they came about, and then potentially
Exactly.
saying, "Well, maybe I shouldn't, be afraid to do this or react this way or, repeat the
Yeah,
pattern."
that's right, because very oftentimes, especially when you're younger, people tell you things about yourself, and you don't know enough to know whether that's true or not true, and I hear very often a story that goes something like, when I was in 3rd grade, my teacher told me I wasn't good at X, whatever that was, and people say it took me 40 years to realize that wasn't true. Maybe it was never true, but it certainly isn't true now, and I thought, "Yeah, that's right." We have so much influence on people in the way that they think, about themselves, and other people have had that with us. So, as I say, that's a huge
It
question.
is. Okay, question 2.
Yeah, question 2 is similar, but slightly different, and that is what, situations and events have impacted your life? These are lucky and unlucky accidents, Unlucky accidents are obvious. You got sick before the big interview and you bombed, right? Or the car accident or something like that, but there's lots of lucky accidents too. You turned left instead of turning right, and something was very different. Or one of my favorites, and I've heard it a few times, is that people will say, "I really didn't want to go to that party that night, but my friend made me go, and that's where I met my spouse." So,
Yeah.
right, had your right, that's kind of a lucky accident.
Yeah, and some of these things obviously shape, who you turn out to be also not just from a personality perspective, but, your ability to see certain things, to influence, to, communicate in certain ways. So that's a really powerful exercise. I think, it's really worth that spending time on.
Absolutely, yeah, and it takes time. It takes time, and
Oh,
it
yeah.
takes a little bit of, I'm gonna call emotional fortitude
Yeah.
because and courage, because, shining a light inside, is sometimes scary, and sometimes we don't like what we see, but that's kinda where I go back to that C.S. Lewis quote of that, "Okay, that is there, but we get to choose. We have more agency than we think."
Yeah, absolutely, and let me kind of add to that in another aspect, though. In this day and age, a lot of our path forward, especially professionally, isn't necessarily a direct continuation of where we've
Uh,
come because of how professions evolve and knowledge changes. A lot of times when you actually do that, you discover that who you are is not the profession you studied or the jobs you went to. It's actually what you know how to do, or the very special ability to see certain things that comes naturally to you, and doing these exercises helps you understand that. I can tell you a story about myself. I'm an embassy kid, right? So I grew
mm.
up on embassies, which by design means I grew up in international schools, and talking to a lot of people from a lot of places in the world. And so my ability to translate languages and cultures isn't, and I don't mean literally, right, came up from that, which allows me to do what I do today, right?
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Actually, I love that story. It also helps you probably be more attuned to people, right? Kind of
The
watching
unspoken
their
element.
yes, the
Yeah,
unspoken.
absolutely, because
Yes.
when you also when you're a kid growing up in this environment, there's a lot of stuff that is new to you and that nobody translates for you because it's not kind of your regular environment that you grew up in, right? It changes on you. So the ability to read a system. So I've been working on the future of work for over a decade, right? And I read trends. And it took me a long time to realize that my ability to take the environment, right, and tell a story from it is a result of that growing up in foreign environments that changed on me, and I
Mhm.
had to figure them out.
Oh, that's great, that's great, but I love that because the backstory informs the present, right?
Yes, yes.
And what you did in that environment, it sounds like you were, attuned, I'm gonna use that word, attuned to your environment, and so that sharpened that skill in
Yeah,
you, right?
yeah,
So if
yeah.
you not been in that environment, you may not be as attuned.
Right, right. And I think, I mean, I do think today it's important we understand these things because what you're capable of doing professionally is more than your job and your profession. Because
Oh,
if you
big time.
understand where you came from, right, and what you know how to do, you ask, so who needs this and what are they calling it when they need me, right?
Absolutely, right? I'm a huge believer in transferable skills,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Yes, I
Okay,
don't think
fabulous. So
that
you're sending us to go look at the people who shaped us and the events that shaped us. What's next?
the next is your definition of success, your personal definition of success in both your professional life and your personal life.
Yeah.
And it's you, I say your definition, not your parents, not society's, or anything like that. And also to try to break it down. So, for example, if somebody says, I want to be CEO of the organization or I want to start a business, I ask the why questions. Why that? What's underneath it, right? What's underneath all of these things? Or I want a certain amount of money. Well, why? Why that amount? What is it implying? So definition of success is third. Fourth is around values, and this is the values, kind of your core values. And again, this is also a really hard question for a
Yeah.
lot of people to answer because these are your values, again, not your parents and not society's. And so people are stumped on this one a lot. So I've come up with, two questions that can be very helpful for people underneath this on values. And one of them is if we were to look at your calendar, what would it tell us about your values, right? These are your enacted values, where you
Where are
spend your
you
time.
spending your time? Yeah.
Exactly. And I always say, what crowds out what? Because, as an example, if you were to ask both my husband and I, our values, both of us would have on our list health and fitness. Right. But if you looked at his calendar, it would be obvious. We've been married for over 30 years and he works out 6 days a week, no matter what is going on in his life. He'll wake up early, stay up late, he'll fit it in. Me, not so much, right? Work crowds out exercise and fitness. So I do it, right? But I am not as am passionate about it. I'm not gonna always make time for it. But, you know, if I have a deadline, I'm gonna make time for that, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So do we both value it? Yes, but in very different priorities, right? So, and you'd see it that way. But the other question behind values is to think about what makes you mad. What really, when you hear it, see it, or something like read about it, really makes you angry. Because very oftentimes, what makes you angry is that a value of yours has been crossed or been stamped on. So, you know, thinking about that, is it, you know, unfairness or, you know,
And why
lack of
is that
respect?
important? So we're back to so there's the self-awareness piece, right?
Mhm.
Which I can totally relate to, but we're talking leadership. Why is that important for you as a leader to
To
understand?
understand your values, because that's the type of environment as a leader that you are going to try to create, is one that is in alignment with your values. It's also a big reason why people are unhappy in whatever job they're in, is because their manager or the organizational culture, there's a values mismatch. And so that's why I always think that if you're in an environment like that, it feels like you're wearing an itchy sweater. You know, it's just not comfortable, and you're aware of that discomfort all the time. And when you really think about values, very oftentimes that's it, right? So
Yeah,
it is
yeah, and
important.
I think it's really important, especially if you're thinking about transitions. So I always talk about the difference between going from something to going to something. And sometimes when you have an
Mhm.
itchy sweater, right? You want to kind of leave this, this whatever it is that
Mhm.
is the environment that's causing that. But if you don't understand the why, you might be going into another situation that's similar, right? So
Oh, I totally agree.
really
Yeah.
spending time on understanding that is important.
Yeah, because I ask people that when they're switching jobs. I say, "Are you leaving where you are, or are you going to a new place?" Right? Because very often, to your point, they are leaving a
Yeah.
place. They're
Yeah,
just going
which is
somewhere.
fine, but you wanna make sure you know how you choose the next one, and I think that's where
Exactly.
this
Yeah.
exercise is very important.
And also
Okay.
values are super helpful in decision making. If you don't really understand your values, when you make decisions, you may be enacting someone else's values, or it won't sit well with you later on. So values, actually, some of these exercises, it's kind of the red thread throughout the book, is going back to some of the backstory, the values, the definition of success. And
So what
also,
happens when
yeah.
there's a difference in values between, what you believe and what the people or a person working for you believes? Because
Yeah.
values are values, I'm not gonna
Mhm.
necessarily change someone's mind.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely correct. So it depends, right? I don't think there's an easy answer to that one. It depends on how big a mismatch there is and how important that mismatch is in the grand scheme of things, you know, for you, for how you make decisions, et cetera. So, you know, sometimes it can be very helpful even just to understand this. If two people have different values, you can understand how they're going to make decisions differently than you. And sometimes those will, you think, wow, I would have made a different decision. And sometimes you think, That crossed a line. I can't live with this." Right?
Yeah,
So it
or
depends.
sometimes it's how they get to the decision. I
Mhm.
think sometimes it's even about how you allocate work to people, or even it can go all the way to empathy, right? So understanding that someone is doing something different, but it's because that's the value, and it might be okay from a work perspective. Different doesn't necessarily mean wrong.
Absolutely. Different does not mean that's a real problem. In fact, sometimes it's a, you know,
Yeah.
hadn't thought about that, hadn't, reasoned it that way. So, you know, it doesn't, just because people have different values doesn't mean that's something to fight about.
Yeah,
It may mean
absolutely.
that it's just a different
Which
perspective.
I think was a thread throughout the book, right? Because basically this entire thing takes us on a journey of self-awareness.
Mhm.
And that just means that this is what makes us tick. And that's
Mhm. Mhm.
the reason we do things certain ways. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's the only way. Once
Mhm.
we understand that, we might sometimes be able to step back, and you talk about that, right? So the ability to step back and look at who you are and how you operate.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And just kind of continuing that fourth the, fifth question is around emotions, and that is to what extent do you understand your own emotions and feel those emotions? And when people say, "Well, I don't know," and I said, "Oh, then I think you do know," right? If you don't know, you probably don't. But a great question there is, who understands that you are mad first? Is it you or is it the person you're with? Because
Oh,
if it's
that's a really
you,
good one.
you're feeling it come up, right? You're feeling it come up. And so you're aware of it. If it's the other person that knows first, you're actually not aware. And I don't mean just anger, it could be sadness or, any of these kinds
Yeah.
of emotions. So that's the fifth one. And the sixth one is around feedback. And that's around what type of feedback have you received in your personal life and your professional life over time, right? And sometimes there's a very common theme, and sometimes it's changed as you've gotten higher in leadership, right? Because you're doing things a little bit differently. And a lot of times people get similar feedback at home and at work. The most common one is around listening. They don't listen well.
Okay,
Um,
now I feel better.
Yeah, yeah. So those are them, and also the other thing I was gonna say is that feedback oftentimes well, all of these, there's a little bit of overlap in each one of these questions, right? So a lot of times our values and our definition of success are interrelated. The feedback we get is often tied to the fifth question around our emotions because the feedback is about how other people perceive us, right? That's that gift that you were talking about. So sometimes they're showing us that how we enact or how we act with our emotions. So some the question five and six are oftentimes very tightly linked.
Okay, that's really interesting. I was listening to this, and frankly, when I was reading this, and I talk a lot of with people that are talking about how leadership is changing these days, whether it's AI and the way we need to manage people who are working with technology in a way that we haven't before, or even the less hierarchical structures of organizations, more fluid, way of working. And I was wondering to myself whether there's something about the journey where we came from that maybe sometimes isn't necessarily a map to where we need to go, or maybe
Mm.
there are things we need to consciously unlearn.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think that is oftentimes, so there's those 6 questions and then there's 3 questions, right? So the first question is what type of leader are you? What words and phrases would you use? Do other people use, etcetera, right? Those are linked to that 6 questions as well, right? That gives you much deeper insight to yourself as a leader. Second question is what type of leader would you like to become?
Yeah.
Right? Words and phrases you would like to be able to use about yourself or you would like other people to use. And then the third question is, okay, what's the delta? What's the difference between the answer to question one and question two? And this gets you on that path of, okay, what do I need to or want to? I say, what do I want to change to evolve as a leader? And that is the thing about leading is that we are constantly evolving as people, right? We're not the same as we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 2 years ago, whatever, because different things happen to us and our environment changes as you're mentioning. So in terms of what do people, with AI and all these different generations in the workplace and things like that, I say anything that helps us understand humans is going to become more valuable.
Yes.
As we have more technology, people think, well, we all have to be computer scientists. I say, no, we
No.
all have to be people scientists.
That's very true. I totally agree with that. In fact, I think that we have underestimated the nuances of human involvement in work. We thought of ourselves as working hands and thinking minds. And now we're bringing in machines to do the working hands and thinking minds. And so we say, okay, what's left? And that's exactly it, the human aspect,
The
right? The
human, yes,
nuances that we need to figure out, which just makes which everything you described in kind of the process you're suggesting that we go through even more important because that is really some of the journey to the value add of what you bring to work that technology won't do.
absolutely. And we need we're going to need people that understand other people in all kinds of different ways. I mean, think about going to the doctor, right? It's how the receptionist deals with you, or over the phone, or the doctor him or herself when you go in to talk to them. It's everywhere. So,
Yeah,
I think AI is going to be very helpful, and I think there's some things we have to really worry about with it as well. Uh,
absolutely.
so I don't think, I think right now it's still new, and therefore I think the conversation is oftentimes on both ends, right? It's like, this is going to be the best thing ever. We're going to have to figure out what to do with all our leisure time. And the other end is, oh my gosh, it's going to kill us all. And so the answer is how we use it, right, is how we use it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did call this podcast The Future of Less Work, and sometimes people react, but I didn't mean it in the dystopian way. I actually meant that I hope we at the future, um, the opportunity to do less of what doesn't matter and more of what does, right? So
Yeah. I
making it a more
inferred that
human
actually
experience.
from the title of it. I didn't think you meant
Thank
the
you.
dystopian, but I thought, wow, wouldn't that be nice? That people could really apply themselves in areas that they feel matters and makes a difference to other people too. So that would be great. I remember reading, oh gosh, this is well over a decade ago, probably, yeah, well, at least a decade ago, where Bill Gates said something about with technology, we all need to figure out what we're gonna do with our extra leisure time, that, and
Yeah.
I remember thinking, "Okay, when will that prophecy come true?"
Wouldn't that be great? I know, which is why I always, yeah, that's exactly the point, because there's so much conversation about, will technology take away jobs? Well, it will definitely take away pieces, and it will redefine. But I, circle back to your question of what is your definition of success, and I do think we're seeing an evolving new social contract, and that's actually a good one, because it's shifting to that win-win between people and organizations, where what we do matters, and also what we do, work doesn't consume everything, right? So life doesn't start where work ends, which is a lot of where
Oh,
work-life
I
balance
agree.
was, right? So
Yeah, I think of it like as personal and professional as opposed to work and life, because to me, it's just work is part of your life,
yeah, it should
right?
be.
It
Yeah,
should be. And if you enjoy your work, which it sounds like you do, and I certainly do, uh, I don't I don't dislike doing it. I actually
exactly.
enjoy
And
doing
yeah,
it.
yeah, exactly. And so that's where I think the future of less work means that you get to decide what you do at any given time, right? And work isn't something you have to do. And so you'll hear me wrap up that particular way every time I end a podcast. Before we do that, I actually want to ask you, for what's the one question you think we should all be asking ourselves about the future of work these days? And I feel we've done a lot of that, but because I'm wondering if you had something else.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, is to really think about, to understand, what am I curious about? What do I find pleasure in doing? Because there's oftentimes work to be done, in that area. I remember hearing, oh, I'm blanking on his name right now, but he ran not didn't run Pixar, but he was, very big in making a lot of the Pixar movies, and he said that as a kid, he, liked to draw and these kinds of things, and he learned that his somehow or other, a library book, that an animator was a job, and he just said that blew his mind, and he said, "Oh my gosh, that's it. I know exactly what I wanna do." And I thought, wouldn't that be great if we all had things like that? That, you find what you like to do, and then you find where you can go do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Margaret, for actually reminding us that leadership is something we practice every day by managing the person in the mirror. I think you gave us a lot of um, questions that are important for who we are, for our relationships, kind of the entire spectrum. So thank you for that. For more
Thank
about
you.
Margaret and manage yourself to lead others, check out the links in the podcast description. And remember, your best people do not work because they have to, because you pay them to, or because you measure them on it. They work because they want to, because by working for you, they're doing what's important for them in life. Till next time.